Welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending this EP by Zoom event, and thanks also for your interest in this very important topic, preserving local reporting in Eden Prairie. I'm Mark Weber, Executive Director of the Eden Prairie Community Foundation. We are a nonprofit that has existed in Eden Prairie for nearly 40 years. We identify new and chronic needs within our community, and then we partner with nonprofits, donors and community members just like you to meet those needs and help make this a better community for everyone. Over the last 5 years, we've generated about $1 million in philanthropy. So on behalf of the foundation, welcome to this event. It will be limited to 1 hour, and we're asking all of our attendees to remain on mute so that the focus is on our speaker without the distraction of background noise or interruptions. And for the similar reasons, we're also using speaker view rather than gallery view. This is really designed to be a one-on-one interview between myself, our guest tonight, and really get to the heart of our topic, which is a new enterprise called the Eden Prairie Local News. We hope it's informative. You're invited to submit questions via the chat function on Zoom, and I'll check it from time to time and relay those to our speaker, at least as many as time allows. Many of you also submitted good questions and topics during the registration for this program, and I'll try to work many of those in as well. I should note that this series of newsmaker interviews is sponsored in part by two foundation partners, Flagship Bank and Eaton Corporation, and so we really thank them for their support. Our guest today is Jenifer Loon, who has served Eden Prairie as a state representative and is a very active community volunteer serving on a number of nonprofit boards of directors, including as chair of the board at PROP. She and her husband Doug are longtime Eden Prairie residents, and Jenifer leads the working group that in recent months has created the Eden Prairie Local News, preserve important local news reporting following the April demise of our 46-year-old community newspaper, the Eden Prairie News. I do need to point out that I am also a member of the working group, and so I don't bring a totally unbiased view to tonight's program. In fact, many years ago, I was also an employee of the Eden Prairie News, and now I oversee the Eden Prairie Community Foundation, which is serving as fiscal sponsor to Eden Prairie Local News until they obtain their own 501c3 nonprofit status. So are you confused by all of that? That's a lot. I know I'm confused. Nevertheless, I'll try to be an even-handed moderator tonight. So welcome, Jenifer, and let's get started. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Mark. Well, I appreciate the introduction, and if I can just add a personal note, I am so glad that, Mark, you are involved with the Eden Prairie Local News. You bring so much professional knowledge and knowledge of the community. And as a longtime journalist, you're a terrific writer, and I know you have some wonderful stories that have been published, articles that have been published in the EPLN. So thrilled to have you in the working group.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. Thank you. So as I mentioned before, you're leading this group of concerned citizens who have launched the Eden Prairie Local News. How did you happen to become part of that group?
Well, I, when the paper announced it was stopping publication, I started talking to friends and other really volunteers, active volunteers in the community. And it was actually Dave Lindahl with the city of Eden Prairie. I was talking with him, and he mentioned that some other volunteers had approached the Community Foundation in your capacity as a convener to talk about issues important to Eden Prairie, and said that there was a meeting that was going to be happening, and said, you should be part of this. You should join us. So I think I probably just called you up or emailed you and said, I'd like to attend the first meeting. And that was back in May. And we've been meeting almost weekly. We've maybe missed a couple in there, but ever since. And it's been a wonderful, wonderful experience and journey.
Well, thanks for doing that. So yeah, it sounds like a lot of meetings, and you've been meeting since May. And I think the Eden Prairie Local News website was up and running by October. But some folks might say, gosh, what the heck took you so long to get going here? Can you give us a little sense of what happened in those intervening months? What was going on during that time?
Yeah. And actually, I think our site was up even mid-September, maybe with an initial test article. But it's all in the eye of the beholder. Actually getting our site up, and that felt pretty fast. But just to give people some context around what happened, so there were a group of right now it's probably about 12 regular volunteers that meet every week, and we have formed what's called a working group, and it's largely the group that started. A couple more have added on, and maybe folks who initially advised us at the very beginning haven't stayed with the effort every week. But we started meeting, and at first it was just a very kind of blue sky exercise. Can we create something to replace the Eden Prairie News? And then everybody wanted to. So then the question is, well, what is that? Do we try to do a newspaper, a print newspaper? So it would look much like what we all felt we had lost. And doing research on what that would be. Do we want to be a for-profit or a nonprofit? What type of entity would we create if we were going to do this? And so that really started us off on, I would say, at least a couple of months, if not more than that, 3 to 4 months of research. So every week people would take assignments, and we started researching communities probably similar in size and some demographics to Eden Prairie from across the country, and specifically looking at local news organizations that had started up. Maybe they had lost a paper, and a group of citizens came together, or some kind of group tried to recreate or start something new. And we were looking for similarities. And so we did that research. We reached out to editors and maybe the publishers of some of those media organizations to find out how they did it, and how do you operate? How did you get set up? What does it cost for you to operate? Do you run with volunteers or with paid staff? And how have you been able to do that? So again, each of the working group members would take assignments. We came together, and we did that with everything. We did that with trying to find similarities to publications we might want to emulate or take cues from in what we created. We did that with looking at sort of the pros and cons of trying to do a for-profit type of business versus a nonprofit. And then did the community want this? I mean, we were a group of 12 people, all pretty active in the community volunteerism, but did the average citizen in Eden Prairie want this? Was this something that they also was feeling was lacking? And so that was probably the other big component. We worked on a market research survey. We developed a list of questions and then kind of pared it down. We didn't want to be too long. And we were able to push that out via email through various organizations in the community that we could get access to email addresses and say, here, could you share this? And so we pushed that out. And that was, I think, July. And we got really good response, over 400 responses, and overwhelmingly people said yes, we absolutely would like to see a new news outlet to replace the Eden Prairie News. And the vast majority also indicated that they would pay for that. They'd be willing to pay a subscription or perhaps a donation for that. And, you know, we asked questions about the types of news coverage they like to see in that. So all of that started us down the path. And then, you know, then it's like, all right, we're going to try digital. We agreed to go nonprofit. And we're still running on all volunteers at this point. Nobody's being paid for anything. So then what could we do with a very low to no budget? And so we looked at templates for email or for websites that we could easily, without having to create something completely from scratch. Could we obtain a template for a website that we think would look and have the look and feel of something that we felt was good for the effort we were going to make? You know, just what was our new name going to be? And this maybe is another question, but you know, we couldn't just call it the Eden Prairie News. While they did stop publishing, the company that owned the Eden Prairie News still exists, and they still own the name and, you know, information and the rights. So we had to go through a process of picking a new name and all of those.
Well, let me ask about that, because starting something up is, gosh, it's just hard, and it sounds like a lot of hard work. And I shouldn't say it sounds like, I know it's been a lot of hard work.
Yeah.
But somebody might say, well, you know, was there any chance of just picking up the name or buying the publication or taking over what, you know, existed there and, you know, maybe giving it a new direction or some local control? Was any of that considered or possible?
You know, we did look into some of those possibilities, but, you know, as part of our research, when we were looking at even what was the circulation of the Eden Prairie News, and some of you may remember that they would send a request for a voluntary subscription. You know, the paper was free. You could get it delivered. You just had to sign up that you wanted it, but they did ask for voluntary. And so they had a list of people that agreed to do that. And, you know, they were willing to sell us that, but it was tens of thousands of dollars just for that information. We also discovered that their operating budget was probably about $500,000. So that just seemed really daunting from our little group of volunteers to try to recreate an organization or a business of that size and that magnitude. The other thing is that, you know, COVID had happened, right? We were in the midst of shutdowns, and we have witnessed community newspapers that have been closing, have been folding, you know, in Minnesota, across the country. And so it just didn't seem like a model that was particularly healthy right now, or one that would be easy to do, as in, you know, newspaper relies heavily on business advertising. And businesses are really stressed with, again, the economic impact of COVID and shutdowns and that. So it just didn't seem to be a viable option for us. So we decided to go nonprofit and to start fresh with choosing a new name.
Well, let's talk about the climate for doing this, because I'm looking right now at a study that comes out of the University of North Carolina School of Journalism and Media, and it says in the last 15 years, more than 1/4 of the country's newspapers have disappeared from inner city neighborhoods, suburbs, rural towns, whatever. And that just in the last April and May alone, so April, May 2020, when the pandemic was really setting in, at least 30 newspapers closed or merged just in those 2 months in the country. So, you know, given all of that, are you crazy starting a news organization when newspapers are failing and then during a pandemic? What were you thinking?
Well, that's a fair question, and maybe so. But again, I think crazy to try something new, maybe. But again, there's a real entrepreneurial spirit within this working group. And if we didn't all know the community of Eden Prairie so well and feel like that connection to our neighbors and wanting that source of information and wanting to stay connected, that we felt was really pervasive within Eden Prairie. And so we felt it was really worth the gamble. And again, going nonprofit and being able to do as many things as we can with volunteers. The risk, we could fail, sure, but the risk, we're not, nobody's mortgaging their house right now to do this, right? And we are expending a lot of volunteer time and effort, but that's something we were all willing to do. So, will it succeed? Time will tell, but so far I think we've been really pleased with our outreach of more citizens and residents of Eden Prairie becoming aware of us. We don't have a big marketing budget or anything to send out, postcards to every mailbox in Eden Prairie and let them know that we're out there online. But our site hits have been growing by leaps and bounds. We're getting some business advertising on. So, all of the indicators are that people are ready for this. They're finding us online, and we're on, many other social media outlets as well. So I'm very encouraged, and is there a right time to start a new enterprise? I've read somewhere, if you wait for the conditions to be perfect, you'll never start, right? You'll never take the leap. So we had a crisis of no local news organization devoted to Eden Prairie. So we're seizing that opportunity, and I'm really glad we are.
Sure.
Has the volunteers decided if they wanted to be online or paper? We just got the local thing we get now, which is a bunch of crap, to be quite honest with you. I basically look at the front page and then throw it away. And I did appreciate the Eden Prairie News. Certainly when our kids were playing sports, we'd love to see those kind of articles and so forth, but also just, kind of what's going on in Eden Prairie. Is there a preference for one or the other? And could a GoFundMe kind of thing work for something like this?
Jenifer, are you still there?
Yep, I'm still here. Yeah.
Okay.
All really good questions. So, as part of the research we're doing, I think, we decided to go digital to get started. The question of a print publication is still sort of on our long range business plan. And, I've done some research on it. The group has done some research. We've looked into it. But again, it's a much more expensive enterprise. It's really probably something we couldn't operate largely with volunteers. And I will say, I talked to the executive director of the Minnesota Newspaper Association, as well as a couple of editors of small town newspapers, local newspapers that currently operate in Minnesota. And, what is sort of a common thread with many of them is that they also, whoever publishes it, owns a printing company, right? So they're able to print their paper, and then they print lots of other things to help make their business profitable. The newspaper itself is not terribly profitable for many of them. And so those are assets we just don't have access to right now. So again, all of that is to say, I think there is a desire by many on the working group, and probably many in the community. I love to read a hard copy newspaper. We still get home delivery of newspapers at our house, but many people have gone to digital. And so in the interest of trying to reach people quickly, try to get something up and going, digital is our option. It doesn't mean we can't go to newspaper at some point, or maybe do an occasional newspaper along with it. And then the funding of it, I think was your other part of your question. You know, we've started on a fundraising effort. We wanted to decided we wanted to get something out there, get our website up, get articles being published. And we're well over 100 articles. In fact, it may even be getting closer to 200 articles that we published. So people have a sense of what it is we're trying to do, the variety of things that we're covering, and that's we're adding to that all the time. But just to know that we are regularly covering the school district happenings, city council happenings, all of that.
I'll share that on my screen, Jenifer.
Okay.
Just give people a quick glance at what we're talking about here.
Yep. So we really wanted to, pick up on those things that people told us in our market survey that they wanted. And also looking at the volunteer journalists that have stepped forward. We've got, as I mentioned, the working group is sort of almost the business organizing side of this effort of the Eden Prairie Local News. But we also have a whole separate journalism committee that's headed up by Brad Canham. He's kind of acting as our editor right now. And we've got about 12 regular journalists, many professional journalism in their backgrounds, like Mark and others that write. And so we're really fortunate to have Dan Huss, who was the longtime sports writer for the Eden Prairie News, as one of our volunteers to cover high school sports, because we knew that's a big draw. That's a big reason why a lot of people like to get the newspaper every week. So we're trying to replicate those things that I think were really meaningful for so many citizens from the Eden Prairie News, in the Eden Prairie Local News, and then also add some new things. You know, many younger readers, probably younger residents, do most of their reading of things in an online format, in a digital format. And so we're really trying to make sure that we are going to be as appealing as we can be to multi-generations of readers for the Eden Prairie Local News.
And sorry if I missed it earlier or you covered it before. Now that I'm kind of semi-retired, I mean,
Hey, Bob, I'm going to ask you to use the chat function if you would. This is really, just an interview between me and Jenifer here. If you wouldn't mind putting your questions up on the chat, I'd appreciate that. Thanks.
Sure, no problem.
So Jenifer, more about this nonprofit model, if you would. What was it that attracted you? Because the nonprofit model isn't one that's a lot of people are familiar with. Was it the concept of volunteers pulling together to do this? Or was it the fact that you could get donations, charitable giving involved? Or what was it that really attracted you to the nonprofit model?
Yeah, yes, I think probably all of the above. I do foresee that we will have strong volunteer components to our writing, and certainly to our leadership. Right now, we call ourselves a working group, but as Mark, as you mentioned at the beginning, we're applying for our own 501c3 status, so that that the leadership group will become a board of directors, like a nonprofit board. And so we do foresee, volunteers being a big component. So I think that was part of it. And the nonprofit 501c3 status or aspect of it for seeking donations. We had a pretty robust discussion on the working group early on about, once we decided to start digital, about whether or not we would have some kind of a paywall where we would ask people, we'd show you a little snippet of an article, but ask you then to pay. We put up a wall so you couldn't see all the content. And we pretty quickly decided that wasn't a model that we wanted to go to. And if you look at other nonprofit news organizations, there's a few prominent ones in Minnesota, and we poach from and borrow ideas from all these people regularly. It's a great source of information for us. But MinPost is one that comes to mind. Now they have many. They pay professional journalists. Many of them are former writers for the Star Tribune or other major media outlets in Minnesota. They went to MinPost. They don't have a paywall, but every time you go on their site, so everybody can look at it for free, but there's something that pops up that asks you to become a sustaining subscriber or donor. And they offer, anything from, $5 a month to others. And so, they also seek grants from foundations. So all of those things kind of helped tip us in the direction of, again, a nonprofit, because for the people who are listening today, I know some of you have donated, and your donation is tax deductible. And so that's another thing that really incentivizes people to want to donate. I think to support a good cause, it's also nice if it's tax deductible. And so that was another consideration for us. One is that the idea of starting something where we don't have to have $1 million budget to get started was very important. We can always grow this, and the more that we can grow donations and resources, we can add more things. I do foresee a point where we're probably going to have to design a new website, so that we can customize it more. There's a limit to what we can do with our current template. Works great, but we may need to customize it more. We'll have to invest in more software for managing our contacts as our subscribers grow and increase. We may, our plan is to hire an editor, at least pay someone part-time, so that we can make sure that we are publishing new stories every day or every week to keep this going. That's a lot to ask of somebody doing it completely for free. So the idea is that we will hire someone to be that editor. We'd like to pay some of our writers stipends. Again, we are getting high quality professionally trained journalists who are writing for us. So to keep that going, and we want those standards to be very high. That was one of our other sort of founding goals or principles, is that this would be a high quality publication, nonpartisan, nonprofit, as we said, but also all of our writers are asked to adhere to the code of ethics for the Professional Society of Journalists. So all of those things kind of led into that discussion, and also to our fundraising model. Right now, I started down this pathway on our fundraising. We have sent appeals out through emails. We made a big push around Give to the Max Day in November. We are now doing some outreach to what we hope would be larger donors, sort of our seed money to get our first year's funding gathered, and that's going very well. We call them founders or legacy builders, and we've had a number of very generous individuals who've stepped up to do that. We've also got a limited list of direct mail that's going out, and then we'll be rolling out some more digital, or social media contacts as well. Sort of the next phase as we get into probably the later winter months into early spring is to ask people to become sustaining donors. So with, fairly, I would say, lower dollar amounts, asking people, would you be willing to give us $5 a month? We can sign up through your credit card for that. And we're going to arrange a sort of a recognition program for our sustaining donors who do that. And we're going to be partnering with Smith Coffee in Eden Prairie. They're very pleased to partner with us on that. So when you sign up at a certain level, you receive a thank you gift from Smith Coffee. And so those are just some of the things that we've got in the works to try to help build our readership, but also our base of financial support. Again, all tax deductible donations.
So Jenifer, if things continue to go as they have in recent months in terms of ad revenue and charitable donations and things like that, what's a possible timetable for hiring an editor or being able to pay freelancers or or having one, somebody selling advertising, those types of things?
Yeah, good question. So our business plan, our fiscal year for the organization runs from July 1st through June 30th. And so that's kind of what we're looking at. So we are, about halfway through our first fiscal year, even though we're not officially a 501c3 ourselves. We are registered as a corporation, a nonprofit corporation with the state of Minnesota. We've got a pro bono attorney, and I will probably miss thanking all the people I need to thank as part of this program, but we've had so many people step forward to help us. But we've got an attorney who's doing work for us pro bono, all of that for free, the filings and that for our legal status and the 501c3 status with the IRS, all that's going on. So we are hoping to have raised, our goal is $50,000. We're well on our way to reaching that. So the goal would be to have an editor, a part-time editor hired by the middle of February. And if we can, also to provide some stipends for writers probably shortly thereafter. Again, it will depend a little bit on how fundraising goes, I would say, for the next month or so, and also on probably arrangements we'll need to make with those writers and some decisions that we'll want the editor to have sort of input and some sway over how we would do that. So is it for all the writers, some writers, how often, what are the parameters we could put around that? I will say, as part of that and part of our outreach, and then down the road, possibly a business person, maybe working on ad sales and that right now. Again, we've got primarily 2 volunteers on a working group who are reaching out to local businesses and getting advertisers on the site. But we are also would love to, if anyone's interested or of anyone, business who may be interested in doing sponsorships. This is something that's pretty common in nonprofit media organizations. So a business could sponsor certain types of content or stories. And so in exchange for that content being noted, it's being sponsored by the ABC company. And so, one example could be, you could have sporting goods stores or retailers with interest in that sponsoring all of the articles on our high school sports teams as part of that. And so, if they would do that, those would be funds that we could use again to pay a sports writer on a regular basis, or create a contract relationship with a writer. So those are all things we're investigating. But again, I think, for certain, the volunteer or the part-time editor is the top priority. Middle of February, we'd like to have that on board.
So the big challenge is sustainability. I mean, that's the big challenge, I think, for this group. Is there's a lot of enthusiasm right now, but can you keep it up over time? If you had to put your finger on maybe 1 or 2 things that you can do that apparently the Eden Prairie News couldn't, what would they be? I mean, what would make the difference? Why would Eden Prairie Local News succeed where another entity has failed trying to do similar things?
Oh, wow. That's a really good question. I think I really feel that one of the assets on our side in this is the fact that we are operated and controlled locally, right? So the Eden Prairie News, actually, the holding company for that was purchased by a big kind of venture capital firm from New York, I think it was. And so they had purchased many other news organizations. And as they did that, they kind of squeezed them for profitability. And some of them they've closed with those interests in mind. And that was really the situation with the Eden Prairie News, because that company still does publish other papers, just not in our community. And so I think the fact that we are being operated and developed locally from people that live in this community is really important. And I think that's, if there was one thing I could point out as being a difference, we are locally run, we're, you know, locally conceptualized. It's Eden Prairie people who have crafted this, are doing it, are doing the writing, are putting this together, are doing the outreach to local businesses, doing the outreach to readers and subscribers. So, and it has a very local feel. I mean, unless you have some experience with the community, you maybe wouldn't be somebody who would think to write about some of the features that we have in the newspaper. I mean, every paper is going to cover, you know, city council and school board, and that's really important. But some of the other, I would say, more human interest and features are things that are unique to Eden Prairie. I mean, Mark did a marvelous article about the old wagon tracks that exist from pioneer days. And his article, I don't know if I should say poached, but was picked up and written about later in the Star Tribune. So we are actually starting to be, some of our stories are getting scooped up and being published by other larger media organizations that, you know, they've been squeezed too. Their newsrooms are not covering as much, sort of, I would say, the suburban news around them. And so we are filling that void.
So there's a lot of community interest in this, and as you say, some of that manifests in the people that are trying to get this thing going. Others manifested in the volunteers who are doing the writing and things like that. One of the big questions that was submitted when folks were registering for this program was, you know, how can I help? What can I do, you know, to help this effort along? What would you say to those folks? How can people attending this tonight help, and how can their neighbors help?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I hope that you all have signed up to be a subscriber. And so that's just a process. You can do it on the Eden Prairie Local News site. And you just sign up with your email address. And what that does is, obviously you can go on and look at the site, you know, multiple times a day if you'd like, and I hope you do. But you will receive an email newsletter, and probably what is about every other week you're sending it out, Mark.
Every week, yep.
Every week now. So and you will only get those emails if you're a subscriber. Again, so those newsletters. And that will give you a little recap of some of the major stories, maybe a preview of some things going on and other things that are happening. So, you know, nonprofit organizations, including media outlets like the Eden Prairie News, you know, we may have special deals or events or perks to our subscribers that we can let you know about through the newsletter, which you would not be aware of or have access to unless you're a subscriber. So, and any announcements and things coming up having to do with the EPLN will be featured there first. So I would encourage you all to sign up for that. Second, obviously, not to beat it too hard, but, you know, if you haven't made a donation and you're thinking about it, we would love it if you contribute. Again, the Eden Prairie Community Foundation is our fiscal host. We have a fund with them. So if you go on the Eden Prairie Community Foundation's website and you want to make a donation, you just have to designate that you want your donation to go to the EPLN, or Eden Prairie Local News. And you can make a donation. You can do credit card, you can do check, and that would be very helpful to us. Again, you'll want to be watching for when we roll out kind of our sustaining donor program later this winter, early spring. to make sure that you do that. So you will get your lovely thank you gift as an item from Smith. And then volunteers. We love volunteers. You make this whole thing work. So if you have any skill and talent, we can find a place for you to help. If you've got great business acumen and information about advertising sales or working with local businesses on marketing to them and what would be appealing to them to have a presence on our site, that would be great. If you're a whiz with sort of planning out, we've got a business plan, we're trying to project out 2 and 3 years down the road of what we're doing. But honestly, things are changing so rapidly. We're updating it very, very frequently. But help with that would be great. If you are a writer, if you've been a journalist or have any journalism training at all, or if you want to learn, I know we've got some folks who haven't done it before, but they'd like to write. We're always looking for people who could contribute content. Again, we want to make sure that we're covering Eden Prairie really thoroughly and the types of things that we can offer to our readers. So if you've got an interesting idea for a story, if you're with an organization that's got a press release about something that's coming up you'd like to tell the community about, and we've got ways for you to plug in with us. So you name it, we can find a spot for you if you want to volunteer with us. And so just feel free to contact us. You can go again on the site. There's a few emails that you can choose. There's one for editor, one for press releases, news tips, all of the above.
So Jenifer, when you're in the news business today, there's a lot of curiosity from people about who's behind the voice, who's deciding what the voice of the newspaper is. I wonder if you could spend a minute or two on the topic of transparency, I guess, to the community, so that the community knows it can trust the reporting that's being done and the guidance behind the paper, that it's going to be professional and it's going to be even-handed.
Yes. So again, part of this goes into our plan of wanting to hire an editor as well, because we want the ability to make sure that the leadership on the journalism side of the paper certainly is someone who's trained in journalism, someone who has experience and can uphold again those standards, those code of ethics for journalists that I referenced earlier, and that's really important to us. So right now, fortunately, we have a volunteer and several volunteers who have been editors of local newspapers. They've got the training, the experience, and know what those standards are and adhering to them. So that's number one. Number two is part of our organization as we're creating our board and we're creating our bylaws that will govern us. One of the things that will be a permanent part of the structure of our nonprofit is an independent committee of journalism standards and ethics. So we will have journalists who are not writers or affiliated with the paper, but people who are probably will be retired for the most part, but professional journalists, at least 3 who will serve on that committee. And so if there's any concerns that are raised by readers, by people in the community about something that's been written in the paper, if they want to raise a question about that or about a particular journalist or anything to do with our coverage, that independent committee will review the issue and will give the board their recommendation on whether it's a valid complaint or concern, if there's something to be addressed in that. So again, we want to be very, very sure that we are kind of following the best practices for professional journalism and making sure that we are have a process for anybody who would have some type of a grievance with the paper. And so that those are just a couple of the things that we're doing. Finally, we've applied to be part of an organization called the Institute for Nonprofit News. It's sort of a trade association, if you will, for nonprofit news organizations. And it started as more and more nonprofit media organizations started to become sort of the viable next thing when a lot of profits were finding it harder to operate. So they are a wealth of information. They have a lot of things available, how-tos in setting up and operating a nonprofit news organization that is free to people, and we've borrowed heavily from it, but they do have a membership structure, and we've applied for membership in this group. And they have standards that you have to adhere to as a nonprofit news organization to be allowed membership. And part of that is transparency in your funding. So we really discourage anonymous giving. I mean, we can accept it for some donors who wanted to make a contribution anonymously, but as part of our Seeking INN membership, any donation over $5,000 must be made public. And so we do have a list of supporters or donors on the site. And so you can go on there and see who's contributed. And that is part of our transparency. So we don't want anyone to get the feeling that, if a business or somebody gives us a lot of money, a donation, that they then will control the content of the newspaper. That's just not the case. That will be up to the editor and the writers and sort of that journalism committee that develops those story ideas. And that's important. That's important in a reliable free press organization. And that's something we take very seriously.
So a couple of good questions from our attendees about budgets and business plan and finances and things like that. I realize the organization is still pretty young. You don't have your board formed yet. Once you have that, you probably have a finance committee and a development committee and things like that, and you become a little more structured. But have you thought about budgets, business plans, hard numbers at this stage?
Yeah, we've got, like I said, we initially started and our goal is $50,000, and we developed that by coming up with what we felt we would have to pay for at least a part-time editor. When I say that, it's 20 hours a week. And I did a lot of research with a number of other publications with other journalists and sort of similar sized communities of local papers. What is an editor paid, and if we had to break it down hourly, and if we decided to offer someone a contract for how many 20 hours a week, what would that be? And then also, just all of the other back office things. Like I said, we haven't spent a lot of money, but we did have to purchase the ability to use sort of the website template, to purchase our domain. There'll be a little bit of expenses for filing for our status with the Secretary of State, and then with the IRS for our nonprofit status. If we've got any other legal issues that we need to address, right now we're looking into the issue of licensing for our content that we put, and so our lawyer does some things for free, but some he will work for basically half of his hourly rate to get that done. So those are all things that we've tried to categorize possible expenses, and I tried to be as thorough as possible in the business plan and then projecting that out. Advertising, I saw in the chat, one of the questions was advertising. So in order to attract businesses to advertise, we came up with a rate card, and we have kind of three main types of advertising. We've got what's called the leaderboard, which runs across the top of the site. We've got down the side, which is almost like a half page or the right-hand column, and then also an embedded ad. So one that would go sort of in the middle in an article. And so we're pushing those options out to the business community and to potential advertisers. We've had pretty good response. I think we've had four to five different businesses that have advertised, some ongoing, some who tried it for a while. But in order to attract them, we offered them a deep discount off of our rate card. So we're hoping to eventually get sort of into market rate with that. Will we be able to, will that be a significant portion of revenue for us? I guess initially I would say, I don't know. I hope so. In looking at models for, again, other nonprofits and news organizations, really probably 30% is doing really well. That's most don't ever get beyond that. So it won't ever be something that will completely cover the cost of our operations, our advertising budget. Again, the sponsorships that I mentioned, that could be another way that we can augment that, and that would be helpful. But most nonprofit organizations, news organizations, still rely heavily on donors, both small dollar and sort of the larger funders or legacy donors, if you will. The other thing that we will look to would be grants from foundations. There are foundations around the country that are really looking at trying to preserve and protect journalism and different types of journalism. And so that's another big reason for us applying for Institute of Nonprofit News membership. I'll say when, I'm confident we'll be accepted, but when we're accepted, that will open up us for eligibility for foundations that specifically work with INN members. They're very helpful with that. And so that would be another source of revenue that we will look to.
And finally, kind of a philosophical question, Jenifer. This is a big deal for you because you're involved in the community and have a strong community spirit. And it's a big deal for me because I like to read local news and things like that. But for really what is probably the majority of our community, which is people that probably don't set aside a lot of time to consume local news, or maybe none at all, why should they care about whether Eden Prairie Local News makes it or doesn't make it?
Well, I think because we are going to cover the kind of things that probably aren't going to be covered anywhere else. And if you need a reliable source of information, maybe you've got to make a decision on something. Other media organizations may cover it, they may cover part of it, but for the most part, and again, as somebody who used to be in the public eye and used to look for information on things, if you didn't have a local news outlet, you probably weren't going to find a lot of the things that you were looking for. And so, again, I think it's really important to helping to keep a community connected. That would be the other big thing. I mean, there's been studies on this, research studies that when a community loses a newspaper or a local news source that covers what's happening within the boundaries of your community or your city, you tend to see less volunteering, more political polarization, and Lord knows we don't need more of that. So you need something that keeps people in the know about what's happening, right? And I think now more than ever. I mean, what's really sad is that with COVID making it so much harder, and we've seen more newspapers, they were struggling before COVID. It just kind of knocked. It was sort of the last straw for many of them. But at a time when people are maybe feeling even more isolated and not being able to interact as much with their neighbors, you need something that brings that sense of community, that what's happening. And so again, for all of those reasons, it's vitally important. You know, a free press, a non-partisan, reliable source of information on your community is just, it's essential. And I think I couldn't say it any stronger than that.
Well, thanks. This has been great, Jenifer. Thank you so much for taking time out to talk about the Eden Prairie Local News, and best of luck with this endeavor. We hope it all succeeds.
Thank you. Thank you. A lot of questions in the chat. I'm trying to read them quickly. I saw a question about letters to the editor and opinion. Yes, we do have that. It is available. So if anyone has a letter they want to submit, please do it. We won't
so
even
I put the email address editor@eplocalnews.org in the chat. That's really a general one for anything regarding content. And in fact, anything sent to editor at EP Local News whatsoever will get directed to the right person, I think.
absolutely.
So if we had one email address that you could really turn to for anything related to it, it would probably be editor@eplocalnews.org. So yeah, some great questions about funding and budgets and advertising content and everything else. So thank you everybody for your great questions tonight and your participation. And once again, thanks, Jenifer, for taking part in this. I also want to remind our attendees that this series of newsmaker interviews is continuing, this EP by Zoom series. We're just going to keep it going, and we've got several coming up that I just want to share with you if I could. We have one coming up on February 10th that really is business related. And I think people in our business community or people who own a business or are in the corporate world might be interested in Luis Moreno talking about emotional intelligence and human-centered leadership. He is an expert on these topics. And that session will be 6 to 7:30 p.m. Wednesday, February 10th. And then we're back on March 11th, 7 p.m. on a Thursday, when we have former Minnesota Supreme Court Justice Paul Anderson on growing up in Eden Prairie. And I know he'll have some interesting stories about what it was like to grow up here when Eden Prairie was much more rural. And you can learn more about these events by going on Eventbrite and just Google EP by Zoom. You can get some detail, and you can also register for these events, which are free. We'll just continue to have these free events as long as people are interested in attending them. And then I would be remiss if I didn't say we would love to have you check out the Eden Prairie Community Foundation website, epcommunityfoundation.org, if for no other reason than to donate to the Eden Prairie Local News. You can go to the donation page and really contribute to any fund here at the foundation, including the Eden Prairie Local News Fund, the COVID-19 Response Fund, or any other funds that we have here at the foundation. And the website is a great resource for learning more about what the foundation is and what it does, and what kind of impact it has in the community. So once again, thank you everybody for attending. We really appreciate your time tonight. Great questions. Thanks again to Jenifer Loon. Have a great rest of the week. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure.